Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Embodied Intelligence Conference. So my name is Josie Hughes, and I'm going to be leading this afternoon session today. So before we get started with this afternoon's program, I just want to run through a few housekeeping rules and then also recap what we discussed for this morning for those of you joining us this afternoon. So hopefully you all had some fantastic breakout room discussions, lots of interesting topics discussions, and we can continue that through to this afternoon. So hopefully you can see my screen okay. Briefly, just some practical information. So talks will be recorded and then also posted online as soon as possible following the beginning of the session, the end of the session. So please do check out the website online, Embodied Intelligence, etc., where you can find these following the end of the event. So we'll do our best. Veronica is working behind the scenes, doing a fantastic job to get these online very soon. Because we have a large number of people, what we will ask is that only the speakers' chairs are unmuted for their talks in this single track part, but please put any questions you have in either the Zoom comments, and we also have a WhatsApp channel running where you can also ask questions, ask support, any other questions you might have. So please use the QR code in the bottom of the screen for that. And also in general, please do use this WhatsApp community to also connect with each other. I think a key part of this conference is building and growing this community. So please do share contacts, papers, etc., questions, so we can really build and grow. And of course, any technical issues, Zoom chat, WhatsApp, or email. And of course, we're here to help you, especially with the breakout rooms towards the end of the session. So, continuing on with what we have this afternoon. We have a full-on program. As you know, we're only in through the first day morning session, and this afternoon we'll continue on. Just a reminder that tomorrow, Thursday, we have another 2 sessions, followed by, of course, Friday, and you can find all this overview program online, and also an invite to join us at the in-person workshop to be held in Lausanne, Switzerland, in the end of April. But looking at our schedule for today. So before we move on to this afternoon's sessions and speakers, it's my pleasure just to give a very brief recap of some of the themes and topics that we discussed this morning, especially for those of you joining us from different time zones. So this morning, everything okay? Hopefully everything's okay. Please do let me know if you can't hear me or if there's any other issues there, and you can't see my screen. But this morning we had a fantastic first plenary talk from Nicola Clayton, and followed by this we had a morning panel and session led by Cecilia Lazzacci with another 4 fantastic speakers. So just to recap briefly on the topics that we discussed. So Nicola Clayton brings a really interesting perspective on embodied intelligence from this kind of psychologist and kind of experimental approach. And she's really looking at how magic effects can help us to understand the animal mind. And I think she led with this really interesting concept of the body shapes what you think you saw. So often I think we talk about from a robotics perspective how the body shapes how you think and how you control, but actually she was saying the body shapes what you think you saw, and how embodiment enables this kind of memory time travel. It gives you this ability to go back in time and make predictions and also kind of remember what has happened in the past. And she introduced this really interesting experimental approach she's focusing on with birds, specifically crows, jays, looking at these caching behaviors. So when you're storing food. And what she was interested in is this mental time travel to understand or look back in the past of what happened and when. And how birds use this for food and have some memory there. But we need this mental time travel to be susceptible to magic effects. And she was showing this experimentally. But that was on this food caching, but obviously there's this issue that birds don't really have manipulators. So to move to maybe more complex magic effects or more complex interactions with the environment when your embodiment is shaping your ability to interact with the environment, she was looking at instead working with monkeys. And this really idea that we need a shared biomechanical capability between maybe the demonstrator and the observer for a magic trip to understand it in others. So this idea that we need some shared biomechanic capability to understand how the other agent can perform and can be behaved. And she was again illustrating this through this French drop magic experiment where a monkey that has some dexterity, precision, grasp could have some understanding of this experiment because of the shared biomechanics with a human. So a really interesting take on embodied intelligence and the role here. And then we quickly moved on. So we then had our morning panel led by Cecilia Lasacci, and there was a real range of topics and some really interesting work shown. And it's really just a brief summary of some of the highlights and some of the topics. So Cecilia Lasacci really introduced, as always, this fantastic vision of embodied intelligence in soft robot arms and octopus, and this bio-inspired approach, but also looking at the challenges and how we can really fundamentally model and simulate embodied intelligence. Moving on to Kento, a really kind of a change to this idea of kind of humanoids and exploiting constraints and intelligence through design. But now also kind of on this co-design or exploiting control for complex mechanical systems, from humanoids that can sweat to also cable-driven systems, repurposing limbs as manipulators. And what I really thought is how in his work, it's really exploiting the full body and also the full environment. So really trying to make constraints with the environment. From then Hongqing, we then have really looking at the soft robotics approach to the need for modularity and standardization in soft robotics to overcome some of the key limitations we can see. And presenting this really interesting Lego-like origami actuators, where we really need to have this fabrication design, but also optimization of their use to make them use. And finally, we had a really interesting perspective from Jonas, looking at this soft robotic aesthetics. So how the soft interface between a human and a robot can kind of can embody meaning and information transfer. And he really showed some interesting human-based experiments on the effect of dynamic color change, how the morphology, rigid versus soft, of a human arm, of a soft robot arm changes human perception, and also even how the frequency of motion of the soft robot has an effect. And I think there were some very interesting discussions also in the panel about should we have a bio-inspired or non-bio-inspired form factor and how that changes expectations from a human on what the robot does. And I think was quite interesting of all of these talks had very different perspectives, very different embodiments, but really looking at how we can create emergence, trying to understand complexity, how to place it, how to optimize it, how to use simulation from all these different viewpoints. However, there were some key underlying points of compliance, of redundancy that really came up in all these discussions, I think, which really kind of demonstrates this kind of underlying field of embodied intelligence that somehow ties these together. So this was a fantastic start to the next 2 days. And it is my pleasure now to also continue on to this afternoon session, where we have another 2 plenary talks, and then we also have an afternoon panel and talk session led by Professor Josh Bongard. So I think we are about right for time. So I'm just going to stop sharing, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Professor John Hutchinson from the Royal Veterinary College in London. So John again brings us a whole new perspective, really looking at the biomechanics of locomoting animals from this really bio-inspired veterinary perspective. So I think this really nicely contrasts with what we had in this morning, really talking about the psychology and looking at animals in this way. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, John. Are you okay to share your screen?